I think it's terribly important to insist on individual values.
Learning Culture Podcast.
Initiative, creation, all these things which we value. It's now possible to make organizations on a larger scale than was ever possible before.
Learning Culture Podcast.
Teach people to analyze the kind of things that are said to them.
What's up, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Learning Culture Podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Barry, and joining me this week is Angus Fletcher. Angus is a professor of story science at Ohio State's Project Narrative. Project Narrative is the world's leading think tank for the study of how stories work. He's also the author of Wonderworks, a book laying out how generations of authors have laid out narrative and plot techniques that can teach us about things like overcoming grief and stimulating joy or increasing creativity. And it's that last point that Angus has spent his last few years exploring really deeply. This is where our conversation is centered, around the premise that you can teach creativity. And that the way we currently do it, think brainstormings and sticky notes and prioritizing great ideas, is the wrong way to do it. In our conversation, we first define what creativity is, which is not about guessing the future correctly, but about being open to radically different possibilities. We also explore how creativity is the flip side of anxiety and the relationship or tension between those two things. And from there, we dive into how stories make you feel a part of something that is bigger than yourself. And here's where we get into some very practical ideas that Angus has been rolling out and testing with the US military, Fortune 50 companies, and large educational institutions. We explore 3 narrative techniques to help you teach creativity. These are world building, perspective shifting, and action generating. And Angus shares some great examples of each of them that you can apply right away at your work. Ultimately, creativity is about tapping the potential within. That's something that I care so much about and is really the key to unlocking learning organizations, to turn great companies into unbeatable learning machines. The work that Angus and his team do really pushes the envelope and I think focuses on one of the cornerstone skills that we need to make that a reality. So if you're with me on this journey, sit back and enjoy this great conversation with Angus Fletcher. Angus, welcome to the show.
I am thrilled to be here, Andrew.
This is truly an exciting topic because I've been thinking about the idea, the concept of, the question of can you teach creativity? And I came across your work probably 1 or 2 weeks ago, reached out to you right away, and you responded right away, much to my surprise. I feel like you guys are onto something pretty exciting there at Project Narrative. And I'm keen to unpack that with you today. To set the scene, a lot of people don't really know about Project Narrative, I would say, yet. I think the work you're doing is super interesting. Why don't you tell folks kind of a little bit about the think tank?
Yeah, so I'm a member of Ohio State's Project Narrative. We're the world's leading academic think tank for the study of story. And so, of course, when you hear that, you think we're a bunch of frauds and charlatans, because what do academics know about story? I mean, first of all, everybody knows that academics don't know anything about anything. And then, as I've learned from my career consulting in Hollywood and other places, the moment that a professor walks into the room and starts trying to explain to you how a story works, everyone is just like, please leave the room immediately. But we actually have a huge array of practical experience in addition to my own kind of background in neuroscience and the work I do with a lot of kind of, psychology labs. I work with the U.S. Special Operations community. I work with some of the world's biggest business schools, teams at Wharton and Chicago Booth. I work in Silicon Valley. I work in Hollywood. I work all over the place. And I guess the kind of the 2 things that I'm kind of most known for are, first, I think a huge part of the operating system of the human brain is story. So I think that actually story is not just a way that we communicate or talk to each other. I think that story is actually a huge driver in the way that we think. And that's why I think that if you change the stories you tell yourself, you change the way you act and you behave. And the other thing that I'm most known for is this kind of demonstration, which comes out of biology, that contrary to what we're told, there are no archetypal stories, there are no archetypal plots, there is no universal good way of telling a story. Story is like anything biological, an evolving adaptive tool. Every person has their own unique story. There's always an opportunity to create new stories. And when you create new stories, you transform the possibilities for life. So I'm very much an innovator when it comes to story. And I very much like to work with people who have new stories to tell.
Yeah. There's lots to unpack there. Joseph Campbell and you would probably not get along too well.
Joseph Campbell and I are like in a knife fight in a telephone booth. I mean, to be clear, I think that the hero's journey can work, and it's fine. But, as I've gone and said on other places, and if people want, they can go on the internet and Google Angus Fletcher and Joseph Campbell. Most of the things we call hero's journeys are not actually hero's journeys, other than the fact that they involve someone who goes somewhere. The net effect of the whole obsession with the hero's journey is to completely make narrative conservative and miss the real point, which is to connect with an audience. A story isn't about some perfect structure that you build in a lab, and somehow if you just kind of get all the parts in the right place, it works. A story is a technology. And so in the same way that you couldn't build an iPhone without having a user in mind, every piece of technology is built to do something in the world. And just like every product and every service is shaped and influenced by customers, and products and services change over time as the demands change. And it's exactly the same way with the story. And so the key to being a good storyteller is not just to be creative, but also to be a good listener. And if you just think you're going to go open a book and go through the 12 or 15 stages or 21 stages or however you want to break it down of the hero's journey and just use some kind of mathematical formula, then you're going to have a story that a computer will love and will make humans fall asleep.
Yeah. And okay, so there's I think this is sort of at the core of narrative technique, right? I think this is the essence of, I think, where we're going to take a lot of this. So you bring that narrative background. You've written an amazing book called, I think, Wonderworks, and the 25 most powerful inventions in the history of literature. I feel like that's an important point to just stick a pin in as well. Can you give folks just a quick example of maybe one or two of those inventions so we can kind of see where that background you're bringing to this idea of creativity?
Sure. So the main point of the book is that we think largely about story as a way of communicating with people, but really story is a technology for expanding your own brain, your own human performance. And so anything your brain can do, there's a story out there that can get more of that out of your brain. So to take an example of the two first inventions in the book, perhaps the most important invention in the history of literature is this invention, which I call the stretch, which basically just creates wonder. And the stretch is just taking anything that is a kind of recognizable pattern or action and then kind of taking it the next step. So taking something blue and making it bluer, taking someone who's smart and making them smarter, taking a star and making it everywhere. So what happens when that stretch hits your mind is it generates wonder or awe, which is the beginning of spiritual experience. And it has this effect on your brain that actually makes you less conscious, less aware of yourself. The barrier between yourself and the world dissolves. That's why we have this experience we call getting lost in a book. And it makes you more generous and more hopeful. And that's why the word literature is a synonym for scripture. That's why so many of us go to books, poems, stories, myths, legends to feel a sense of something bigger than ourselves. A kind of classic example of a stretch is an ancient god. An ancient god is just a human stretched to become bigger, stretched to become more powerful. That's what creates that sense of awe. So that's a very basic one. And then the next invention I talk about in the book is for inspiring courage. And courage is not something we talk about, I think, enough in the modern world. We sort of have this attitude that somehow the world is meant to be a nice place and we should do everything we can to kind of, customize it to individual users. But the reality is that life is inhuman, at least if you're a Darwinian and a biologist as I am. And really, the key to life is to realize that it is a hard and hostile place. And this is something you get in ancient religions, ancient stories, gods coming out of the sky, ripping humans out of their lives for no reason, floods coming, annihilating humanity, anger, rage, psychopathy from the heavens, And this is all this emotional reflection of the fact that life in a minute can strip you of everything. It can strip you of your loved ones. It can strip you of your dignity. It can strip you of your hope. And so you need courage. You need to be brave. You need to get up in the morning to face the day and feel bigger than yourself. And so I talk about this technology, which is developed by Homer, but then has kind of continued through the modern novel, through authors like Charles Dickens, for creating what is called a kind of God voice, which is a voice that feels with humans but is bigger than us. And when you read it on the page, it has the effect of making you feel that you're a human but bigger. It's the same psychological effect you get from singing a song with people when there's a masked voice, a bigger voice. The same effect you actually get from singing in the shower when you hear your voice, and it just stimulates courage. There's a kind of neurochemical reaction I talk about in the book, but it just makes you feel bigger and braver. And that's why a lot of times when you pick up a book and you're feeling fragile, that book can make you feel, I am bigger, I'm part of a larger narrative, I can go and face things. And so those are kind of two simple technologies.
Wow. So, okay, super interesting here. A lot of these things, so to kind of ground it to the audience here, right? I talk about learning culture, work with companies to develop and cultivate learning cultures. And everyone I talk to is extremely concerned with what I've started to call sort of timeless skills. And you mentioned courage would be a great example of that. Everyone wants their workforce, their team, their people to be courageous in what they do. Creativity is obviously another one of those. And everyone's trying to figure that out. And I think that's what drew me to your work in the first place, was that you approached this in a way that says, okay, we actually can teach this to people. We can actually develop these skills, which are it's those soft skills. Like, I prefer timeless, but it's often the thought of it's something that you're born with, right? That's often what people would think. And you're saying, no, you can probably develop these. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, no. Well, of course you can train creativity. And I should be honest about my own kind of entrance into the world of training creativity, which is that I didn't expect to be doing it. What happened is after I published the book, I got contacted by a professor, Greg Bunch, who's at the University of Chicago Booth, so one of the world's big business schools. And he called me up. He says, Angus, you have this wonderful book about kind of how to use stories to increase human performance. I teach entrepreneurs. Can we kind of teach these entrepreneurs to be more creative? Is there a story that can help them do that? So I said, sure, absolutely, there's a story to do anything. So I started working with them. That was a very successful project. It led me to get connected by Greg to the United States Army. I ended up writing their new field guide to kind of train creativity in senior officers. I was then connected to special operations, and I'm now working with the special operations community to do the same thing. And so these are a series of techniques which we have used with, some of the, best entrepreneurs, some of the kind of, people who are kind of thrown into these kind of chaotic and volatile environments in terms of special operations. And so we know that they work. And again, they go back to harnessing the story power of your minds. Being creative is not about making logical decisions. It's not about being a logical person. Up to this moment in history, the kind of dominant theory of creativity training is something known as divergent thinking or brainstorming. These are all logic processes, and we just know they don't work. There's been a ton of data on them that they don't work. But we also know intuitively that there's a lot of very simple things that can help you build creativity, such as imagining yourself as a different person. If you pretend you're a different person, if you play the part of a different character, all of a sudden that kind of starts to open things up a little bit. If you imagine that the world is a little bit different, then you start to see possibilities that you don't see. And so what we do in our training is we take those basic insights and we make them much more rigorous. And we really start to kind of develop and build on them so you can kind of see this yield.
Yeah. Okay, so let's dive into this, because I think this is going to be fascinating for anybody out there listening that wants to promote, encourage, enable creativity at their company. Let's first talk about, let's just define creativity. You do a great job of this, and there's two things you've said that I want to unpack here. One is that creativity isn't about guessing the future correctly. It's about being open to radically different possibilities. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, we can just start with the fact that creativity is an innate function of the human brain. So even though it's true that you can learn to be more creative, we're all born creative. And why are we born creative? We're born creative because humans had to evolve in fast-changing, volatile, dynamic environments where nothing was particularly stable. And we had to be able to come up with creative ideas. We had to be able to see emergent opportunities, see emergent threats, and respond fast to them. And so, a big part of being creative is just kind of like tapping in to that natural power that you already have to be dynamic. And what happens in those moments is, unlike a computer is always trying to predict the future. So this is the idea behind data-driven decision making, which is honestly largely bogus. We need to get out of this psychology that we've gotten ourselves into over the last 30 years, that somehow if we just have enough data and it's good enough, we can predict the future. I mean, I hope that the events of the last 3 years have convinced people that no amount of data could have predicted any of this stuff, I work with a lot of hedge funds whose AI algorithms have just exploded recently, So, once you accept that, like, you can't see the future because it's too volatile and uncertain, then what the purpose of creativity training in the present is to make yourself more flexible and able to react faster to the present. Because what you see is that most people freeze when change happens. They freeze, and then they look to someone else to tell them what to do, or they try to go back to something in their past that worked. And if you train yourself with creativity, then actually you're the opposite. You seize the initiative in moments of volatility. You see that moments of volatility are moments of opportunity, and you react quickly. And if you can train a team of people, or if you're a manager and you have a team beneath you, and you can empower them to react faster in those moments because you trust them, because you devolve authority and decision-making to them, then all of a sudden your team can just work much faster than any other team, because it's trying things in this space. And even though most of the things it tries initially are going to not work, because that's the thing about creativity, is you can never know in advance if it's going to work, they're going to react faster off their mistakes, and they're going to get quicker and quicker and quicker at the new thing, whatever it is, and they're going to make the future while everyone else is still sitting back in their chairs trying to figure out what the future is going to be.
I love this. There's a bias to action within this. There's an acceptance. There's an experimental, like, MVP type philosophy to it. It's all of these things underpin what I see as a learning culture within a company, and there's a decentralized nature to it as well. You're sort of ceding power for creation to the people, right? And you're enabling it. So you're giving them the tools and the right constraints and guardrails and all that to be productive within that space. That's super helpful framing. I want to add one more sort of direction to this, and it's this. I think in your fascinating conversation with Jordan Peterson, you said the flip side of anxiety is creativity. I was, as soon as I heard that, I was like, I want to ask him. I don't think Jordan Peterson followed up that one specifically, but I'd love to know what you mean by that.
Yeah, no, Jordan did not follow up on that. I think he was too confused by some of my other ideas. So what I mean, what I mean by that is, well, first of all, let's even just take a step back. And the fact that we're so obsessed in our culture with anxiety is a problem, And as a result of that, we then have this kind of focus on kind of like mindfulness or meditation, all these kinds of things. We're constantly trying to make our minds less anxious. Well, the reality is the human mind is anxious for a reason, because that is nervous energy. And that nervous energy is the source of a huge amount of creative ideas. And if we're constantly trying to make our minds less nervous and less anxious, we become less creative. We become more zen. We just kind of go with the flow and the way things are. And that's totally fine if you want to be part of a system and you want to go along and you want to trust everything around you in the architecture. But if you want to be alive to the possibilities of the moment, you have to tap into the fact that your brain has this nervous energy. And where does that nervous energy come from? It comes from the fact that the brain is not unified. The brain did not evolve to be a unified engine. It evolved to have multiple different sources of power and process going at the same time, so that it's in a constant state of inner conflict and tension. And that's why anyone who's a creative knows that all creativity comes out of a moment of tension, of conflict, either between you and your environment, or you just feel something isn't right. And then out of that tension and conflict comes flow. So creativity isn't endless tension, it's not endless anxiety, but that's the root engine. And then once you get that engine going, you can power it into flow and you can start to go. But you have to realize that when your brain starts to get anxious, that's not a negative thing. It's not a sign to get rid of the anxiety or kind of root it out or there's something wrong with me. It's actually lean into the anxiety. embrace the anxiety, have gratitude for the anxiety, and then leverage the anxiety into creativity, which then produces joy and all these other kinds of positive gains. So that's the kind of the beginning of a very natural process. And because we're so obsessed in our culture with happiness and having things too fast, and we get very uncomfortable the moment we encounter difficulties and challenges, we also get very self-conscious. We cut off a lot of these natural biological processes at the roots rather than leaning into them and leveraging what is a moment of discomfort into a kind of long-term sustainable gain.
I love that. It's like anxiety is the signal, creativity is the response in the present moment. Joy is kind of that resolution, and then the flow that comes is where you produce your best work.
That's exactly right. No, that's exactly right. And there's many analogs of this in other parts of life. You know, I mean, grief, for example, no one likes to experience grief, but grief is a huge source of growth emotionally for us all. We all mature through grief. Mm-hmm. You know, we become aware more of the things we have and how to protect them through grief. And so a huge part, I think, of being a healthy, productive person is not to run away too fast from negative feelings, but to kind of lean into them enough to kind of get that positive, propulsive energy that they provide, and then kind of let it carry you forward. So you're not dwelling in anxiety. Certainly, if you've been experiencing long-term anxiety or it's a constant thing, I'm not saying that that's positive, you know, and I would never want anyone to kind of be in a long state of grief. But what I'm saying is if you suddenly have a moment of anxiety or something has been bugging you or you're concerned about something, a lot of the answer may come in terms of leaning into that and actually trusting that inner tension in your head to generate something that your conscious mind is not aware of, because your conscious mind is a tiny part of your brain. We vastly overrate the conscious mind. There's this huge engine sitting beneath it which can do an enormous amount of work. And a lot of that work is kind of shrouded in mysticism and mystery. And this is where you kind of get these kinds of Jungian things, which, as you may be aware from listening to the Jordan Peterson podcast, I'm not a Jungian. But there's nothing mystic or mysterious. You don't have to be a magician to think that your unconscious mind, like your stomach or your heart, is doing a huge amount of work that you're not aware of. And you want to lean into that kind of muscle power that is there. And if it's anxious perhaps for a good reason.
Yeah, vulnerability is another one. Like I'll throw into the mix there. We hear a lot on this show because that's something that we're trying to promote more in the workplace, and all the good things that flow from demonstrating that. So that's super helpful. I want to ground this now, because I think that's at a conceptual level now very clear. Like that. It seems to me like narrative technique is the process you've developed and are potentially developing still. I want to ask you about that as well, around the sort of harnessing of that unconscious intelligence that we have. Is that a fair assumption? So, I mean, if you think about what a narrative is, let's even just throw the word out. Let's get rid of narrative. Let's just say plot. What is a plot? A plot or a story comes about because there's a conflict. Everyone knows that conflict is the basis of any plot. And out of that conflict comes action, comes forward momentum, comes a release of energy. You're transported to a new place. And then at the end of that new place comes discovery, joy, satisfaction. And so that same process that I talked about in the brain, starting with anxiety, that's the conflict. That conflict drives your forward momentum, drives your story, drives your arc ahead. And then that arc becomes flow, which then leads to these kinds of payoffs, just like any journey does. And so a huge part of this narrative technique is identifying productive sources of conflict, productive sources of tension, and then learning how to kind of ride them and roll with them and kind of see where they go. So before, a lot of people are listening now are probably thinking like, okay, this is great. Tell me, how can I start to do this in my company? And we're going to break down, I think in the paper that you released, there are 3 sort of techniques, which I want to dig into with you. Before we do that though, I feel like one thing that has to be there is the conditions for people to be open, to be vulnerable, to be comfortable with anxiety. How have you done that? You've worked at, like you mentioned, these large military, organizations or groups within the military. You've also worked with Fortune 50 companies. Like, how are you creating that condition for people to embrace this?
So all of this comes from trust, which comes from honesty. And those are very simple words, but they're very hard to get. And I think we all know that. And I think that, it's been my experience that honesty is something that ultimately has to be modeled first by leadership. And honesty doesn't mean telling other people the truth about them. Honesty doesn't mean coming into a room and being like, here's all the 5 things that are wrong with you. Honesty means coming into the room and being like, here's how I failed. Here are my mistakes. Here are the things I'm uncertain about now. Here are the things I'm scared about now. And then doing that in a real way. Now, if you're a leader and you just kind of drop that on everyone too fast, that can be overwhelming. But if you come in and start to become comfortable by saying, I'm really scared about this, or I really don't know about this, or I really screwed this up, but you do it in a way that makes it clear that that's a source of actual confidence for you because you're comfortable admitting that, then other people start to feel confident too. And it doesn't become about a wallowing in mistakes or failure. It becomes about an acknowledging them as, again, a source of conflict and tension, because those are in tension with your expectations and your desires and your drives. And then how do we fix them and how do we move forward? So honesty is the number one thing. It's the hardest thing. And I do think it has to be role modeled either by leadership or by courageous team members.
Yeah, I love that point. And the modeling of the behavior you want to see is also a consistent theme from people that we talk to on the show. I guess I can't resist the follow-up question there is, in your work, if you come in there and you find a leader that's resistant to that, anything that's worked for you to sort of get them to see the benefit of doing this?
Sure. Well, the first thing that I often do with leaders is I'm just honest myself. I'll go into a room in a very public place and I will say things about myself that I don't like to admit. And I will invite people to ask me any question about myself and I will answer it honestly. I've said things that have surprised people with my honesty and kind of my own kind of failures and vulnerabilities. And so I think, first of all, you kind of model the behavior yourself and you sort of maybe a little bit embarrass the leader and also make the leader also maybe a little bit admire you. So I think to a certain extent, you kind of have to lead the leader in those cases. Beyond that, at a certain point, what I always say to people is you can't change people. And I never go anywhere trying to change people. I mean, that is not my job. My job is not to change people. My job is to give people the opportunity to change themselves. And I would go crazy immediately if I was trying to change people. It just does not work. And, if you walk into a company and it's clear the leader does not want to change, does not want to do these things, I would say to the employees, there's another company out there with a leader who does. And you can go to that company. And that is the way the system works, And I think once leaders realize that and recognize that, then they have a gut check moment. And they're like, okay, am I going to step up to this challenge? And I think most people are leaders because they've stepped up to challenges in their lives and they're not scared of that moment. But again, at the end of the day, you can't make another person change.
Yeah, that's a great answer. That makes a lot of sense. Hey, it's your host, Andrew here. I wanted to take a second just to say that if you're enjoying this podcast, we would love it if you did a couple of things for us. If you're watching this on YouTube, please hit that subscribe button. It really allows us to grow the channel and reach a lot more people like you. If you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts, take a moment to leave us a rating and review. It's a great way to give us some feedback and to tell the world what you think about this podcast. So whether you listen to it on YouTube or you listen to it as a podcast, if you take one of those actions, it would mean the world to me and my team. Thank you, and with that, right back to the show. Okay, so you've got a company that's embraced this. You've got the leadership setting that tone at the top. I keep sort of putting this off. Before we dive into the narrative techniques, I want to just break apart the idea of brainstorming. So you wrote a great piece in the Harvard Business Review around like why brainstorming doesn't work. And I think that's a helpful framing for people because it's often the first place we'll start, right? When we're trying to say, let's do a creative session. So why doesn't brainstorming in this traditional sense work?
Well, first of all, everyone knows it doesn't work. So, I mean, and no one has ever challenged me on the fact that it does work. I mean, all brainstorming could ever do is just kind of release a bunch of ideas that people sort of just already had in their heads onto a whiteboard for us to talk about. But it doesn't generate radically new ideas. And there's a lot of reasons for this, but I'll throw out a couple that we can kind of use to kind of prime the discussion. The first is that most of these brainstorming discussions begin with everyone writing on the chalkboard, these are the challenges that we face and here are the opportunities we face. The moment you write challenges and opportunities on a board, it primes the human brain's hopes and fears. The moment you prime your brain's hopes and fears, it shifts into short-term reactive thinking. It starts thinking, what can I do immediately in this situation to either get that thing or get away from that thing? And so you just shut down all the creative circuits in your brain. And that is why brainstorming almost inevitably yields answers that are short-term answers that are, for the most part, highly obvious. And of course, the other thing with brainstorming is it's like trying to train for a marathon in the middle of a marathon. It's like, we've got to run faster.
Yeah.
How do we make ourselves run faster? It's like, well, we're already running because we're in the crisis situation, And if you really want to encourage creativity in your company, you have to do it before it's needed. You have to have training exercises that are not actually the real thing. Because then it's not a training exercise, it's the real thing. And all you're going to get at that moment is the creativity that currently exists in your team. You're not increasing any creativity. You're just exercising whatever happens to be there already. So, if you are serious about increasing the creativity in your team, you have to actually do exercises prior to when they're needed. You have to go and, run those sprints. You have to lift those weights. You have to swim those laps. You have to do all that preparatory work, train those basic skills so that when you get into the actual situation, you've built up those muscles in your head and they can react faster and more flexibly.
Yeah, no one's doing brainstorming with that sort of open-ended, like, practice for the future thing in mind. Yeah, that's a really good point. I love the sort of emphasis on long-term thinking. It's sort of reacting or responding in the moment, but with a long-term view. I also think there's echoes of deliberate practice in here, where you create the environment to put it into action, and the military does after action reviews, like that. I'm sure that sort of plays into this as well, where you kind of reflecting on what works and what doesn't work, and all the time you're not trying to respond to a specific situation necessarily, but you're trying to prime and train yourself to be able to respond when that situation comes.
That's exactly right. And so, before you go on a mission, you think of all the ways it could go wrong. You do a pre-mortem, and you play through in your head all these different scenarios that could unfold, and then probably none of those will actually unfold. But because you've got all that flexibility in your head, when something else unfolds, you're more able to react to it. Then after the mission, you think to yourself of all the things that could have gone wrong. You're like, we were really lucky that this happened and that happened, and we weren't expecting this, and it was kind of a freak, fortunate, accident. And then you kind of, again, play through your mind all the ways it could have gone differently. And the technical term for that is counterfactual thinking. And that is a huge engine of creativity. It's often misunderstood as critical thinking. Critical thinking is actually not, it's become this like weird term that is now used for everything. But actually what you want to develop is that skill of counterfactual thinking against the facts, both pre and post, to your point. And that is, again, a narrative skill. It's telling a different story. The story could have gone this way. It could have branched that way. These are all narrative skills.
Okay, so let's dive into a few of these now and start to tease out a couple of examples. You share some of them in the research and that, but I'm very curious to find out more about specific things that you've run and sort of like how it's what I alluded to earlier. Like, is it developing? Like, I assume you're constantly working on this, refining it as a technique. So just to frame it for folks, there are three main techniques I think that you listed in the research, which is world building, perspective shifting, and action generating. Sort of like three types of techniques. If that's still sort of important to the conversation, can you perhaps like define and maybe give an example of each of those three?
Sure. So, the simplest way to think about these are all versions of story thinking. So story thinking is your brain thinking in story. And when we think of what exists in a story, there are three main things that exist in a story. There are the characters who are in the story, there's the plot of the story, and then there's the world in which the story takes place. And so let's start with world building. So one of the things we do all the time naturally when we're kids or when we're writing a fantasy or a sci-fi novel is we change the rules of action. We say, okay, in this world, it's possible for people to fly. Or in this world, it's possible for humans to breathe carbon dioxide or whatever. And once you make that tiny shift, all of a sudden everything changes. One tiny shift in that rule of the world causes everything to change. And so one of the things that we immediately encourage people to start to put pressure on is the rules of their world. And we say, let's identify the rules of your operating space. What are the rules that you work under? We sell insurance to these people and they come to us for this, that, and the other thing. And say, okay, fine. Now I want you to identify one of those rules and I want you to change it. Once you've changed that rule, I then want you to cash out all the consequences of that one change. And I don't want you to just stop with one thing. I want you to play it forward a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 50 years, 100 years. I want you to keep pushing as far as you can go into a new world. See how much you can change the environment by changing one little thing. And, that's the same basic thing, of course, that happens anytime a new technology is invented. We have the computer. Yeah. The computer is actually a pretty simple thing, but that one shift all of a sudden has completely reorientated our landscape. And if you could have gone back to when, ENIAC first went online in the 1940s and seen even a fraction of that, you would be so much richer than Elon Musk, because you would have seen all these opportunities miles before they came, And so that's world building. Yeah. And again, the thing there to do is, I just want to emphasize this to people. The rules that you shift and the worlds that you imagine are never going to come true. That's not the point of the exercise. The point of the training is to build up those muscles in your brain. Yeah. Then what's going to happen is you're going to be sitting in your company, and then one moment you're going to actually have one of those moments where, because you've practiced this skill over and over and over again, something that comes up in a specific meeting or something you see while you're walking through the airport or whatever, you're suddenly going to be like, okay, that's the future. And because you've trained that muscle up in your brain, you have primed your brain to be ready to kind of do that huge world shift.
So I think this is a very important point, because I think at one point it was sounding like you could have been describing scenario planning, right? Where you're like looking at like different, medium, low and high risk environments, and regulations change, what effect does that have? And so you create these like very practical plans for these things that may, happen to some degree of intensity. But that's not what you're saying at all. You're saying like there's no output to that moment other than the training of the brain so that you are ready to respond when it comes up.
And scenario planning is exactly the same as brainstorming. I mean, it's always conditioned by your hopes and your fears. And you're just never, ever going to come up with the actual future that way, because it's always inclining to what you're nervous is going to happen or what you hope is going to happen. And so we've just done these studies over and over and over again, and we show that when you do scenario planning or brainstorming, people come up with basically 1% of the possibilities of the future, because they're so constrained. And of course, occasionally something that you hope or fear will come true. I'm not saying that it never comes true, but I'm saying that really only comes true about 1% of the time. And then, of course, you have this kind of bias, this affirmation bias, where you think, oh, look, I got it right that one time, and therefore my hopes are always true, my fears are always true. And what you want to do is you want to actually practice this outside of areas where you have immediate hopes and fears. And you want them to be real world scenarios so that you're not just in a fantasy space making up jetpacks or whatever, but so that you're actually training those muscles in a hard way. But you don't want them to be literally what your company is going to be dealing with in the next year or 5 years. You want it to be a more expansive space. And when you do that, I can guarantee you will start to see things coming in from outside. You'll start to see things opening, and you can't take advantage of most of those, but every once in a while something will come along and it will change the way your company operates.
Yeah, this is great. Let's give an example of perspective shifting and action generating, and then we can kind of tease those about a bit more.
Sure. So perspective shifting is that other part of the story we were talking about is a character. So if you have one character in a story and another character in a story, they'll react differently to the same problem or situation, because we all react slightly differently. And so the key to perspective shifting is to try and imagine yourself as somebody different from yourself. And the way you do that is you take on that person's motives and motivations as your own. And so we can often do this in teams by, we ask a team, we say, hey, we put maybe two people together and we say, hey, solve this problem. Then explain to each other why you solved the problem this way. And now we give you a new problem, and each of you are going to solve it the way the other person solved the old problem. So you're going to learn from your partner how they solved the first problem, and then use that motivation to solve the second problem. What happens when you do this is you don't become the other person. I mean, no matter how much you and I hung out, Andrew, I could never become you. I could never think exactly like you, right? And you could never think exactly like me because our brains are so different. But what I can do is I can pick up different bits of your thinking that then hybridize with my thinking and then create a third person, essentially. And that third person thinks differently from either of us and can see opportunities and answers that neither of us can see alone. And so that's a huge thing we do in teams. And it's basically a way of taking a 4-person team and making them into a 16-person team, because you start to hybridize all their different brains together and come up with all these different possibilities. And then again, when a disaster strikes, everyone just has more ideas because they're thinking like more people. They have more different kind of narrative engines churning in their head.
It's a perfect example of being open to radically different possibilities. That, like you said, that multiple, that 4x4, just exponential new ideas for people. Action generating, quick example for that.
So action generating, I mean, again, the core of action is just conflict. So what you're trying to do there is you're trying to create new or original conflicts. And a simple way to do that, just to kind of tailor to the two things we've said previously, is what if you take a character from one world and put them into another world? So, what if you take one of the characters from your perspective shifting exercise and then put them into the world you've just built? What happens then? And there's going to be a conflict between that character's motives and the opportunities of that world. And, you can do the same thing if you take one person from one company and throw them into another company, or anything like that. That's why consultants are usually somewhat effective, is because they're essentially coming in and creating all these new conflicts from outside. And so this is just a simple way, and there's millions of ways to create conflicts. They're not just about characters and worlds, but that's just a simple example of how you can activate that same thing to generate a conflict.
And then the idea is, how would we respond? And that's where all the muscle building comes in.
Yeah. How would that character respond? And then all of a sudden you're thinking like another character in a different world, and you're starting to build up all these things in your head. And then, when you've built up those muscles, it suddenly becomes much more easy for you to think like a different customer. And you think, oh my goodness, this customer would react differently if these services existed. And neither that customer nor that service exists yet. But by thinking in that way, you can start to kind of generate these new opportunities and these kind of new market spaces. Yeah. And this stuff once you get in this frame of mind, it just becomes constant. And you can come up with so many ideas. And then, of course, the question becomes, how do you select between them? Which is a big part of what I wrote the Harvard Business Review article about. Because all of a sudden, if you have all these ideas, what do you do with them? Because creativity is not the same as innovation. And in fact, a lot of very, very high creativity ideas are very low on innovation potential, because basically, it's like Leonardo da Vinci's helicopter. That's extremely creative. It never flew. It wouldn't fly for 400 years. Right. Most companies wouldn't want to come up with an idea that wouldn't become profitable for 400 years. And so you then have this thing of, okay, we've got all these really creative ideas. Which ones do we start to pick because we think they have high innovation potential? And that's a kind of another step of the process.
Yeah. Can we go there for a sec? What are some of those principles? Because, I'll come back to the other question I had, but I just want to follow on that thought.
Yeah. So the simple way to do it, and again, people can read the Harvard Business Review article, but what you really want to be doing is you want to be matching your uncertainty to the uncertainty of the times. I hope that doesn't sound too like Vatic or eccentric, but basically, if you're in a very stable working environment, you want to pick ideas that are actually fairly boring. Because, if a senior leader who's been around for a while looks at an idea and nothing is really changing in your market space, and the senior leader's like, that's a pretty good idea, it's probably a pretty good idea. But if you're in a highly volatile space, then you want to pick ideas that you're extremely uncertain about. And the reason for that is not because those uncertain ideas are somehow intrinsically better. It's because all the ideas that you are certain about are not going to work. And they're a waste of time because they're basically designed to work in a different operating space. And you have to start jumping faster and faster to more extreme ideas. And this is something we work with a lot in the special operations community, is when a situation suddenly turns highly volatile, you have to start trying increasingly more and more aggressive things in that situation. Because if you fall backwards into your playbook, then all of a sudden you're actually just using a whole bunch of things which are wasting time and are never going to work. And you have to have the courage and the confidence to start trying to go ahead of the moment. And even though that's scary for people, the thing I always say is your competitors are dealing with the same thing. they're dealing with the same volatility. And so really, as long as you are going faster with these ideas and seizing the initiative more aggressively than your competitors, you're still probably going to win because they're stuck trying the old ideas. And so even if you have a huge failure rate in these moments of volatility, your failure rate is still going to be more successful than your competitors because they're just in a kind of zero-win situation.
Yeah, there's such a key point there. Because my question was around like measurement of this, and I feel like, so I just want to bookmark that point. Like the idea of the velocity of creativity is very, very important here. It's not the necessarily the quality of the ideas, because we don't know, right? So it's more the velocity of being able to generate them and then respond and keep going, right? So I think with that in mind, my question was sort of, well, how do you measure the success or the efficacy of a program like this at a company where time is scarce, right? And so people often responding to actual things in front of them, some of them might be resistant to like, why must I come sit and brainstorm something that may or may not ever happen? So how do you sort of demonstrate the results of this process?
Well, this is a great question, and I can't pretend that I have an answer to you in the sense that we've only developed this training in the last year. So I can't point to something from 50 years ago and say we invented the moon rocket. All I can say is that when we onboard these techniques in companies, they almost immediately call us back in a couple of weeks and say we've already started piloting one of the ideas that came out of these initial sessions. And because what happens is you just realize that it's working. You realize that you're having more ideas. You realize that those ideas are full of promise. You realize you don't know if they're going to work, and you start to get curious and see, I want to see if they are working. And one of the key things I say to people is that just because an idea is creative doesn't mean it's expensive. There's lots of smart ways you can pilot creative ideas, and we all know these ways. So you can have a lot of creative. It also keeps employees motivated and engaged. I mean, when I work with companies, a huge amount of like burnout and disengagement is just driven by boredom and repetition and a loss of autonomy in the workspace. And if you start saying to your employees, you know what, do you want to come on this kind of like crazy, pilot thing that's kind of based on an idea that you and your team had, and I don't know if it's going to work or not, but if it does work, it's going to be really exciting, people will sign up for that. Yeah. And, people are happy to sign up for stuff that goes down in flames and then jump on and try it again because they feel engaged. And so these are all these things which are not logical, but are very emotional for people. They make emotional sense, not logical sense. Yeah. And you have to remember that humans are not logical. And if you try and run your company on this, optimization and efficiency and we're wasting time, you actually grind your employees down. Whereas if you have a company that's like adventure, trying things, a little bit of risk, people get up in the morning excited to come to work. They give more energy. They think about your company more of the time when they're not at work. And so you actually get a much higher yield from humans by doing things that seem inefficient.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is hard for you to measure. And I appreciate that point. In fact, I empathize with that point. It's actually uncanny how similar the work that we do and the work that you do in that aspect. Now, we've also only been doing it for about a year. We create these shared learning experiences to cultivate a learning culture, which it helps people integrate work and learning. And we get all these side benefits of innovation, new ideas, surfacing challenges that people are having that those experiences have brought to the surface. All of these other things, but it's hard to sort of point at a very specific outcome that you can go and say, well, this is what you're going to get. There's almost a bit of a trust the process.
Well, I mean, honestly, how could you ever say to someone you had that idea because of the creativity training as opposed to the fact that you were naturally creative and were always going to have that idea? Do you know what I mean? How on earth could you go into someone's neurochemistry and determine whether the source of the idea was their natural creativity or the training? But what we do know is that human creativity has increased in terms of the scale over time. And we can look back historically and see these processes take root. In my own work, I'm fascinated by the fact that Shakespeare is a huge engine of creativity. And if you look at a number of very kind of highly creative people, whether it's Einstein or Marie Curie or Van Gogh or whomever, they're all reading Shakespeare and they're using Shakespeare in the same way. And these techniques are all coming out of Shakespeare. So there's plenty of examples in history of which are anecdotal, of these techniques being used by high creative people. And there's plenty of evidence from neuroscience that these are the primary engine of creativity. So even though it would be very hard to identify individual examples and say this has to be that, we just know that this is the mechanism in the brain which is driving this. And it's therefore commonsensical to assume that if you refine that mechanism and make it more powerful, then it is in some way increasing your yield.
I have no doubt whatsoever that you will get better and better at all of that, at sort of positioning that whole thing. And this, to me, I'm just completely convinced in this idea, the work behind this. I'm kind of excited that it's only a year in, and sort of, excited to see where it goes. I think the thing that excites me the most about it is that it recognizes the potential for creativity is latent almost in everybody. And what you're doing is creating the conditions and enabling it to come out. It's very much similar to what we do, and recognizing that potential is latent within people, and we just create the conditions for them to realize it.
One thing I can say for sure is we can know that a lot of the current corporate culture and education culture is inhibiting creativity. So even though you might doubt the science of us increasing creativity, there is hard science that the current way of doing things is decreasing creativity. We know that to be the fact. We know that, and we have tons of measurements from education, and you can see in the article in the New York Academy of Sciences, all that stuff. So if there's one thing I would say to people is whether or not you believe that you can increase creativity, you can definitely decrease it. And that is a hard fact. And we know a lot of the practices that are decreasing it. So at the very least, remove those practices from your organization.
Yeah.
And the fastest way to remove them is to just lean into some of these other ones that you and I have been discussing.
That's a great way to frame it, actually. For me, it's replace creativity with curiosity. That's probably the sort of ultimate one that to me is being eroded by not having a learning culture. So that was super helpful. I love how you think about this, Angus. I think we're running up to the end of time here. I could probably talk about this for another couple of hours with you, but I want to kind of give you the opportunity to wrap it up here, and maybe with a final question before kind of how people can learn more about this. Where is it headed? It's only a year in. You're working with some amazing organizations, getting to get real world data on all of this type of stuff. Where's it headed?
Yeah, well, basically, we're doing a series of large randomized controlled trials with the U.S. military, which are being run by the military, not by me, I should say. They're being run by Dr. Richard McConnell of the Commander General Staff College, which is important because that means that, I'm not there to tinker with things. We're doing a lot of studies now with kids and with other organizations. And the main thing is that, that article we published in the New York Academy of Sciences has now become the 4th most read article ever in the history of that journal already. And it's only been out for about a month.
Wow.
So I think you get a sense of how deeply it's starting to kind of like penetrate into people's consciousness. And it really just completely overturns the existing way that creativity has been trained so far. So my hope is that actually where it's going is that a lot of other people are going to take this up and run their own trials and refinements, because this was not honestly an area that I intended to enter into. I mean, my focus is really how different kinds of stories can increase your brain's performance. I mean, that's always what I've been fascinated with, and I've been fascinated with the diversity of human stories.
Right.
And I ended up doing the creativity thing because it turned out, well, that was an area of need. But my guess is that, people will be creative with my creative idea, and things that I don't anticipate will come out of it. And, we'll just have to kind of react to that future as fast as we can when it comes.
Yeah, well, it's a good thing you're well trained in doing that. Angus, it was thank you for taking the time. I know you've got a lot going on now. There's this is just increasing in popularity, so it's really cool to spend time with you, kind of going through this and hearing where you are right now. So thanks for doing that. And if folks want to learn more about it, we've mentioned a bunch of things. The HBR article, the journal article will include links to all of that. Anything else you'd encourage them to check out?
Well, I mean, if they want, they can go to my incredibly low rent website, which is angusfletcher.co. There's a link there for the creative guide that we wrote for the U.S. Army, which people love. I mean, people have been handing this stuff out all over, companies and places like that, and it is a public domain work. And I also have been encouraged and have just recently joined LinkedIn. Because apparently you can't exist in the business community without LinkedIn. So if you want to friend me on LinkedIn, you can be my 6th or 7th friend or whatever it is.
I will do that right after this. Angus, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Andrew. Really, anytime. It was a pleasure.
Hello. I hope you enjoyed that episode. It's Andrew again with a quick message. If you'd like to support the show, the best way to do that is to leave us ratings and reviews where you listened. If you're on YouTube, hit the like and subscribe buttons and feel free to leave a comment. We love hearing from our listeners and viewers. If you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts, please take the time to give us a rating and leave a review. Once again, we love hearing from our loyal listeners. If you're listening to this on Spotify, please hit the follow button to make sure that you don't miss new episodes as they come out. And as a reminder, this episode is sponsored by the Learning Culture Experience, a first of its kind cohort-based learning experience for learning professionals, in which you will join a community of 50 other innovative learning professionals designing and developing cohort learning experiences that you can roll out in your companies. To find out more about the program and when the next cohort is starting, check out curiouslion.cloud/experience. See you next week for another episode of the Learning Culture Podcast. Thank you for listening.